Ballyvaughan, County Clare, Ireland, September 1845. While neighboring families spent their autumn days planting additional potato ridges for winter security, Margaret O'Brien could be found each morning gathering plants that other tenant farmers pulled from their fields and burned as weeds. Her behavior puzzled the village. She was wasting valuable growing time on vegetation that belonged in compost heaps, not dinner pots. Margaret had devoted 3 of her family's precious acres to cultivation, but only 60% held potatoes. The remaining land sprouted dandelions, nettles, wild garlic, chickweed, and fat hen, plants that Thomas Brennan, the village's most established farmer, deliberately eradicated from his fields. Brennan's family farmed 6 acres, with 90% dedicated to potato cultivation, the same percentage that sustained nearly every household in County Clare. His planting strategy followed generations of proven agricultural wisdom. Potatoes provided reliable calories, stored well through winter, and met rent obligations to English landlords who measured tenant productivity and potato yields. The O'Brien approach made no economic sense. Margaret's husband Patrick felt the weight of community judgment each time he passed Brennan's orderly fields on his way to their unconventional garden. Father Michael Quinn, the parish priest, whose opinions carried considerable authority in Ballyvaughan's 340 residents, expressed concern about the O'Brien family's peculiar practices during his pastoral visits. The church encouraged productive agriculture and proper stewardship of land. Growing weeds seemed neither productive nor proper. Mary Doherty, the village matriarch whose 3 generations of family had farmed the limestone karst region known as the Burren, spoke more directly. "Proper families don't waste good land on rabbit food," she told her daughter-in-law within Margaret's earshot at the village well. "Those children will learn hunger if their mother keeps planting livestock feed." The O'Brien children, 4 ranging from 6 to 14 years old, endured teasing at the hedge school about their family's weed stew and dandelion dinners. Their lunches of nettle bread and chickweed soup drew mockery from classmates whose families ate proper potato-based meals. Young Sean O'Brien, age 12, came home asking why they couldn't be normal like the Brennans. Margaret responded to criticism with quiet persistence that revealed deeper knowledge than conventional farming wisdom. When Thomas Brennan directly questioned her methods during September's harvest gathering, she offered a simple explanation. "My grandmother survived the year of the slaughter this way," she said, referring to the devastating famine of 1740 to 1741 that had killed perhaps 20% of Ireland's population. Margaret's grandfather had been a hedge school herbalist, teaching forbidden Catholic children while documenting edible plants throughout Western Ireland. That knowledge had passed through her mother to Margaret, who maintained careful records of which plants provided nutrition during crop failures. Patrick O'Brien supported his wife despite community pressure, though he privately worried about their family's isolation. His own father had died young from potato dependence, surviving on little else during a bad harvest year in 1822. Margaret's approach made intellectual sense, but social conformity carried survival value in a community where cooperation meant the difference between endurance and eviction. September 1845 brought troubling reports from Ireland's southern counties. Potato blight had appeared in Waterford and Wexford, destroying crops with unprecedented speed. The disease turned healthy plants black within days, reducing stored potatoes to putrid slime. Ballyvaughan's residents discussed the reports with concern, but not alarm. Bad weather happened. Weak seed stock occasionally failed. Their own potato ridges showed healthy growth as autumn progressed. Thomas Brennan predicted a strong harvest. Father Quinn assured parishioners that Providence would provide. Mary Doherty reminded everyone that her family had weathered difficult seasons before through hard work and faith. Margaret O'Brien continued gathering her weeds, teaching her children to identify edible plants by leaf shape, growth pattern, and seasonal availability. While neighbors prepared to harvest potatoes, she harvested knowledge that her grandmother had insisted was more valuable than any single crop. October 1845 brought the blight to County Clare with devastating swiftness. Thomas Brennan discovered the first signs on October 9th, black lesions spreading across potato leaves in his primary field. Within 5 days, the disease had consumed 40% of Ballyvaughan's potato harvest. Families opened storage pits to find their winter security transformed into rotting masses that filled root cellars with the stench of decay. Brennan's family lost 800 pounds of their expected 2,000-pound harvest, leaving them dependent on 200 pounds to sustain 6 people through winter and spring planting season. The O'Brien family experienced proportional losses. Margaret's smaller potato allocation meant 300 pounds lost from an expected 750 pounds. But her autumn mornings had produced results invisible to neighbors, counting remaining potato stores. Her drying sheds held 400 pounds of preserved wild plants, carefully processed through methods her grandmother had taught. Nettles hung in bundled clusters, their leaves containing more iron per ounce than the spinach wealthy families purchased in market towns. Dandelion roots filled cloth sacks, ready for roasting into coffee substitute that cost nothing and grew everywhere. Wild garlic bulbs lay preserved in salt, chickweed dried on racks, and fat hen seeds awaited grinding into flour supplement. Community response to the blight followed predictable patterns, shaped by generations of potato dependence. Father Quinn organized prayers for divine intervention while assuring parishioners that the remaining crop would sustain them through careful rationing. Thomas Brennan calculated his family's daily potato allowance, reducing portions to stretch stores until next harvest. Mary Doherty's household implemented strict meal schedules, eliminating waste and supplementing potatoes with purchased oats when possible. The prevailing explanation blamed bad weather, weak seed stock, or natural agricultural fluctuation. Next year's planting would restore normalcy. Margaret offered foraging instruction to neighbors during October's weekly market gathering. She brought samples of edible wild plants, explaining identification techniques and nutritional properties her grandfather had documented. Nettles provided protein and iron that prevented the weakness plaguing families on restricted potato diets. Dandelion greens offered vitamins absent from stored tubers. Wild garlic possessed antibacterial properties that helped prevent the infections appearing in crowded cabins, where malnourished families shared close quarters. 3 younger women listened with polite interest, but took no samples home. Their husbands followed conventional agricultural wisdom. Father Quinn thanked Margaret for her community spirit, but suggested that proper families should rely on traditional foods supplemented by Christian charity if necessary. Wild plants belonged to desperate times that God-fearing Ireland had moved beyond through agricultural progress. Mary Doherty's assessment was more direct. "We're not livestock to graze on field weeds," she told the women gathered at the well. "The O'Briens can eat their peculiar diet, but my family maintains dignity even in difficulty." The O'Brien children continued enduring mockery at hedge school, now intensified by their relative health compared to classmates whose families had implemented strict potato rationing. Young Sean returned home in November asking why they ate better than families with larger potato stores. Margaret used the question to teach plant identification, taking her children on dawn foraging routes that revealed food sources growing abundantly across the Burns limestone landscape. Winter 1845 tested the competing strategies. Brennan's family consumed potatoes twice daily, stretching stores through smaller portions that left everyone hungry. The O'Brien household ate 3 times daily, combining reduced potato portions with wild plant preparations that provided varied nutrition. Margaret documented the difference in her grandmother's journal. Her children showed no signs of the listlessness appearing in neighboring families. Patrick's chronic cough, present every previous winter, had not returned. The wild garlic and nettle tea seemed to strengthen rather than merely sustain. By March 1846, subtle health differences had emerged across Ballyvaughan. Families on potato-only diets showed pale complexions and reduced energy. Children missed school days due to weakness. Margaret's family maintained normal activity levels while consuming 40% less potatoes than conventional households. The evidence was visible but not yet acknowledged. Spring planting season arrived with renewed optimism. The blight had been unfortunate but surely temporary. Thomas Brennan planted 1,800 pounds of seed potatoes across his 6 acres. Father Quinn blessed the fields. Mary Doherty predicted abundant harvest that would restore proper eating habits and end talk of weed consumption. Throughout Ireland, farmers planted potatoes with the confidence that 1845 had been an anomaly. Margaret O'Brien planted her usual 60% potato allocation and quietly expanded her wild cultivation areas. July 1846 destroyed Ireland's hope with a completeness that made the previous year's losses seem merciful by comparison. The blight returned with devastating totality, blackening entire fields within 48 hours of first appearance. Thomas Brennan watched his 1,800 pounds of seed potatoes transform into rotting waste, salvaging only 180 pounds from acreage that should have yielded 2,400 pounds. Across Ballyvaughan, across County Clare, across all of Ireland, the pattern repeated with mathematical precision. 90% crop failure. Families faced winter with stores representing 1/10 of normal provisions. The O'Brien family's 900 pounds of planted potatoes yielded 90 pounds of salvageable harvest, proportional losses matching their neighbor's catastrophe. But Margaret's summer mornings had produced results that now separated her family from community devastation. Her foraging routes had already accumulated 600 pounds of wild foods by August. Weights carefully documented in her grandmother's journal, using the kitchen scales Patrick had built from limestone rocks and rope. Silverweed roots, dug from shudi areas where limestone met soil, provided starch content approaching potatoes themselves. Sea beet and samphire gathered from coastal margins 3 miles distant offered minerals absent from any cultivated crop. Hawthorn berries, blackberries, and sloes, preserved in rendered animal fat, created calorie-dense stores, requiring no purchased sugar. Government response came slowly and inadequately. Sir Robert Peel's relief measures provided Indian corn, a yellow grain Americans called maize, that Irish families had never encountered. The corn arrived whole and rock hard, requiring preparation knowledge that nobody possessed. Families who boiled it like oats created indigestible masses that caused severe stomach distress. Margaret knew from her grandfather's notes that corn required soaking in lime water to release its nutrients and soften its texture, a process called nixtamalization that Native Americans had developed centuries earlier. She shared this knowledge at market gatherings, demonstrating proper preparation that made the foreign grain edible. By September 1846, the practical mathematics of survival had become undeniable. Thomas, Brennan's family of 6, faced winter with 180 pounds of potatoes and whatever cornmeal they could purchase at prices inflated by desperate demand. Their daily consumption had dropped to one potato-based meal, supplemented by the unfamiliar corn when money allowed. The Brennan children showed the hollow-eyed appearance of insufficient calories, their activity levels declining as bodies conserved energy. Mary Doherty's household was selling furniture and tools to purchase food, trading possessions accumulated over generations for temporary sustenance that delayed rather than prevented starvation. The O'Brien household maintained 3 meals daily through systematic combination of food sources. Margaret's calculations, recorded nightly in her journal, showed wild plants providing 800 to 1,200 calories per person per day. Sorrel leaves gathered from shaded areas offered vitamin C that prevented the bleeding gums already appearing in families eating only stored grains. Wild garlic provided antibacterial compounds that explained why the O'Briens showed no signs of the infections spreading through crowded cabins. Acorns, gathered by the hundreds of pounds and processed through careful leaching to remove bitter tannins, created flour substitute that extended their limited cornmeal supplies. The technical knowledge required for wild food survival exceeded simple gathering. Hemlock resembled wild carrot closely enough that misidentification meant death. Margaret taught her children the distinctions with the precision her grandfather had demanded. Wild carrot showed hairy stems and carrot smell when roots were crushed, while hemlock displayed smooth, purple-spotted stems and musty odor. Acorn preparation required multiple water changes to leach tannins that would otherwise cause severe digestive illness. Nettles demanded careful handling before cooking, neutralize their stinging compounds. Thomas Brennan appeared at the O'Brien cabin in late September, pride finally broken by his children's hunger. His request came hesitantly, asking if Margaret might show his wife proper nettle preparation. Margaret responded without judgment, providing dried nettles from her stores and demonstrating soup preparation that transformed the stinging weed into iron-rich nutrition. Brennan noticed what others were beginning to see. The O'Brien children maintained healthy color, while his own grew pale and listless. Father Quinn requested a meeting in October, asking Margaret to prepare a written list of edible plants for parish distribution. His theological certainty about divine providence had confronted the reality of parishioners dying from starvation-related illness. Mary Doherty watched the O'Brien family's continued health with the calculating assessment of someone whose own grandchildren were weakening. The village that had mocked weed consumption now faced winter knowing conventional wisdom had failed catastrophically. Margaret's peculiar knowledge represented the difference between survival and death. January 1847 arrived with a cruelty that would forever mark Irish memory as Black 47. Winter cold, combined with absolute food scarcity, created conditions where survival required resources most families no longer possessed. Thomas Brennan died on January 14th, his body weakened by months of insufficient nutrition. Finally succumbing to fever, his immune system could not fight. Father Quinn conducted the funeral, the first of what would become 4 to 6 burials, weekly through winter months that normally saw 1 or 2 deaths monthly. Brennan's widow and 2 surviving children showed the skeletal appearance of advanced starvation, their bodies consuming muscle tissue to sustain basic functions. Mary Doherty's household suffered 3 deaths by February: her son, his wife, and their infant daughter. Mary herself survived on workhouse rations, the institutional relief that required surrendering all possessions and dignity in exchange for minimal food that kept recipients barely alive. Her grandson, age 8, accompanied her to the workhouse, his swollen belly indicating the protein deficiency called kwashiorkor that physicians were documenting throughout Ireland. Ballyvaughan's population, 340 residents in September 1845, had declined to 287 by March 1847. The missing 53 represented deaths, workhouse admissions, and desperate emigration by families who sold everything for passage to America. The O'Brien cabin stood in stark contrast to the community devastation surrounding it. All 6 family members maintained health that neighboring families could observe through windows during Margaret's evening foraging instruction sessions. The children continued limited schooling, while classmates disappeared into workhouse systems or succumbed to starvation-related diseases. Patrick's documentation showed their survival strategy in mathematical detail. 40% of daily calories from wild foods, 30% from purchased cornmeal, 20% from preserved stores accumulated during previous seasons, and 10% from their remaining potato supply that lasted through careful rationing. The visual proof became undeniable during Sunday Mass attendance. O'Brien children showed healthy coloring and normal energy levels, while neighboring children displayed the listless movements and distended abdomens of severe malnutrition. Margaret's family maintained body weight within normal ranges, while adults throughout Ballyvaughan exhibited the emaciated appearance of bodies consuming themselves. The difference was measurable, visible, and impossible to attribute to luck or providence. Father Quinn organized an emergency gathering in the O'Brien home on February 18th, acknowledging that conventional responses to famine had failed catastrophically. The meeting represented complete reversal of autumn attitudes when proper families rejected wild food consumption. Desperate villagers now crowded into Margaret's cabin, watching as she demonstrated winter, foraging techniques that represented their only survival option beyond workhouse admission or death. Dried seaweed gathered from coastal rocks during low tide provided iodine and minerals absent from grain-based diets. Margaret showed proper identification of edible kelp species versus toxic varieties that caused illness. Nettle tea preparation, using plants she had dried during summer abundance, delivered iron that prevented the anemia-weakening families eating only cornmeal. The bleeding gums and loose teeth plaguing Ballyvaughan's residents indicated scurvy, vitamin C deficiency that wild sorrel and preserved rosehip syrup could prevent. Margaret distributed her stores of rosehip syrup, explaining the preservation method that concentrated vitamin content from autumn harvests. Acorn preparation demonstrated the technical knowledge separating successful wild food use from dangerous experimentation. Raw acorns contain tannins that cause severe digestive distress and kidney damage. Margaret showed the leaching process her grandfather had documented, crushing acorns into coarse meal, then soaking in multiple changes of water until bitter taste disappeared completely. Properly processed acorn flour provided caloric density that stretched limited cornmeal supplies, creating bread substitute that cost nothing beyond labor. Wild garlic preservation in salt created antibacterial food that helped prevent the infections killing malnourished families whose immune systems could not fight common illnesses. Margaret explained that her family's health resulted not from single miracle food, but from nutritional diversity that conventional potato dependence could never provide. Nettles supplied iron, sorrel provided vitamin C, seaweed delivered minerals, wild garlic offered infection protection, and acorns contributed calories. The combination prevented deficiency diseases, devastating families eating monotonous grain-based diets. The women who had dismissed Margaret's methods in autumn now took careful notes, asking detailed questions about plant identification and preparation techniques. Father Quinn requested multiple copies of her edible plant documentation for parish distribution. Thomas Brennan's widow, her husband dead from preventable malnutrition, asked why Margaret had not forced them to listen. Margaret's response carried the weight of preventable tragedy. I offered to teach in October. Your family called it livestock feed. The room fell silent with the recognition that dozens of Ballyvaughan deaths could have been prevented through knowledge one woman had tried to share. Community guilt, mixed with desperate determination to learn techniques that might save whoever remained alive through Black 47's merciless winter. Spring 1847 brought renewed wild plant growth across the Burns limestone landscape, and Ballyvaughan transformed into what regional poor law officials would later document as the village that learned to forage. Margaret trained 15 women in systematic plant identification during March and April, conducting dawn foraging expeditions that revealed food sources growing abundantly within walking distance of cabins where families had starved. The women learned to distinguish edible chickweed from similar-looking spurge by crushing leaves and observing the milky sap that marked spurge as toxic. They practiced identifying young dandelion leaves, most nutritious before flowering, when bitterness remained mild, versus older plants requiring cooking to become palatable. Father Quinn integrated foraging guidance into parish activities, posting seasonal plant availability charts on the church door and organizing Sunday instruction sessions following Mass. His theological framework had shifted from viewing wild foods as desperation measures to recognizing them as divine providence, manifested through creation's abundance. The priest who had dismissed Margaret's methods now copied her grandfather's plant documentation for distribution to neighboring parishes, where starvation continued unabated. The O'Brien children organized foraging brigades among Ballyvaughan's young people, teaching identification skills with the confidence of experienced instructors. 12-year-old Sean led expeditions to coastal areas, showing other children how to time seaweed gathering with tidal patterns and distinguish edible kelp species by hold-fast structure and blade texture. His 10-year-old sister, Bridget, specialized in woodland plants, teaching proper nettle harvesting that avoided stings while maximizing tender leaf collection. The children who had endured mockery for eating weeds now served as teachers whose knowledge meant survival. Thomas Brennan's widow adopted comprehensive wild food gathering with the determination of someone whose husband's death proved conventional wisdom's failure. Her family's spring diet consisted of 60% wild plants, supplemented by minimal cornmeal purchases, a reversal of previous potato dependence that kept her and her two children alive through months when neighboring villages continued experiencing high mortality. Mary Doherty, released from the workhouse in April, became an advocate for foraging knowledge among older women initially resistant to changing lifetime agricultural assumptions. She taught younger women with the authority of someone whose 3 family members had died from ignorance she now refused to perpetuate. The measurable outcomes by summer 1847 provided mathematical proof of knowledge's life-saving value. Ballyvaughan's mortality rate dropped 70% compared to winter months, declining from 6 deaths weekly to fewer than 2 monthly. 23 families had adopted diversified foraging strategies that combined wild plants with purchased grains and surviving potato stores. Community members identified 180 edible plant species within 5-mile radius of the village, creating food security that neighboring parishes lacked. Comparative data from surrounding areas showed continued high death rates where traditional knowledge remained dismissed or unknown. Margaret conducted preservation technique workshops throughout summer, teaching methods that would sustain families through the coming winter. Drying nettles required specific timing before seed development, when leaves maintained maximum nutrition. Smoking fish and seaweed together created preserved protein that lasted months without refrigeration. Fermenting wild greens using salt brine, a technique her grandmother had learned from German immigrants decades earlier, produced sauerkraut-like preservation that maintained vitamin C content through winter storage. Recipe development became essential for making wild food palatable enough that families would consume adequate quantities. Nettle soup flavored with wild garlic and sea salt created familiar comfort food from foraged ingredients. Acorn cakes, sweetened with mashed blackberries, provided treats that encouraged children's continued foraging effort. Dandelion coffee, roasted until roots achieved deep brown color and bitter chocolate aroma, replaced the tea that families could no longer afford purchasing. Regional recognition arrived by autumn, when County Clare relief officials visited Ballyvaughan to document the community's anomalous survival rates. Representatives from 3 neighboring parishes traveled to learn Margaret's techniques, bringing her to conduct foraging instruction in villages where mortality continued devastating populations. Her consultation with the relief committee organizers led to systematic documentation of wild food resources throughout Western Ireland, creating written records of traditional knowledge that oral transmission had nearly lost. The 1847 potato crop failed again, with the same devastating completeness that had destroyed 1845 and 1846 harvests. But Ballyvaughan families faced the 3rd consecutive failure with resources their neighbors lacked. Knowledge had transformed from individual eccentricity to community survival strategy, creating food security that potato monoculture could never provide. Margaret O'Brien's status had completed its transformation from village fool to village savior, though she rejected the latter designation as firmly as she had ignored the former. She was simply doing what her grandmother had taught, preserving knowledge that conventional wisdom had abandoned. The 1850 census revealed what community observation had already confirmed through 3 years of comparative survival. Ballyvaughan's population had declined 16% from its pre-famine count of 340 residents, losing 53 people to death, emigration, and workhouse displacement. County Clare's average population decline measured 28%, nearly double Ballyvaughan's losses. Neighboring parishes without systematic foraging knowledge showed devastation ranging from 25% to 35% population reduction. The statistical difference represented approximately 40 lives saved through knowledge Margaret O'Brien had tried to share in autumn 1845 when neighbors called her a fool. Child survival rates provided even starker evidence of traditional knowledge's value. Ballyvaughan children survived at 68% rates compared to regional averages of 52%. Disease mortality, particularly from scurvy, typhus, and dysentery that killed thousands across Ireland, occurred significantly less frequently in villages that had adopted wild food supplementation. The nutritional diversity that Margaret's grandfather had documented prevented deficiency diseases, while monotonous grain diets left immune systems unable to fight common infections. 7 surrounding villages adopted systematic foraging by 1849, their leadership convinced by Ballyvaughan's measurable outcomes that traditional knowledge offered survival advantages modern agriculture lacked. Margaret trained 43 women from other parishes during 1848 and 1849, conducting multi-day instruction sessions that covered plant identification, seasonal availability, preservation techniques, and preparation methods. The women returned to their communities carrying both practical skills and written documentation, rare formalization of knowledge that oral tradition usually transmitted through family lines across generations. Hedge school curriculum throughout Western County. Clare modified to include edible plant identification as standard subject matter, alongside reading, mathematics, and religious instruction. Children growing up in post-famine Ireland learned dual agricultural knowledge, conventional crop cultivation combined with wild food foraging that provided security against future crop failures. The integration represented fundamental shift in how communities understood food production, moving from monoculture dependence to diversified resource management. Cultural attitudes toward wild foods transformed from markers of desperation to symbols of practical wisdom. Families intentionally cultivated formerly wild species in kitchen gardens, encouraging nettle growth along stone walls and maintaining dandelion patches where previous generations had eradicated them. Deliberate preservation of weed areas around field margins became standard agricultural practice, creating managed wild spaces that provided food security without sacrificing cultivated crop space. The land use that neighbors had mocked in 1845 now represented recognized best practice in post-famine Ireland. Margaret's consultation role expanded beyond local instruction to regional agricultural planning. Poor law officials designing relief strategies for future crop failures sought her expertise on wild food availability and preservation requirements. Her methods appeared in regional agricultural reports, documenting successful famine response techniques. Parish gatherings throughout County Clare requested her demonstration of foraging methods, creating demand that kept her traveling between communities for months each year. Patrick's meticulous documentation, maintained throughout the famine years, provided historians with detailed records of how traditional knowledge had saved one community when modern systems failed catastrophically. Comparative family outcomes illustrated the mathematical consequences of early versus late knowledge adoption. The Brennan family survivors, Thomas's widow and 2 children, emigrated to America in 1849, following the pattern of millions who fled Ireland's devastation. Mary Doherty's reduced household survived through adopted foraging techniques learned during Black 47's worst months, though her 3 family members who died represented permanent losses that earlier knowledge might have prevented. The O'Brien family maintained their small holding, avoided emigration, and passed foraging knowledge to the next generation through systematic instruction Patrick incorporated into his children's education. Village families who learned Margaret's methods during autumn 1846, before winter crisis arrived, experienced 12% mortality rates. Those who adopted techniques during desperate winter 1847 months showed 35% mortality despite belated knowledge. Families who never adopted systematic foraging, either through skepticism or isolation, suffered 45% or higher mortality rates. The mathematical progression proved what Margaret had tried to explain in September 1845. Diversified food knowledge provided survival insurance that single crop dependence could never match. By the 1850s, Ballyvaughan children could identify 50 edible wild plants by age 8, distinguishing safe species from toxic lookalikes, with the precision their grandparents had reserved for potato variety identification. The village that laughed at weeds for dinner had survived catastrophe through knowledge one woman refused to abandon when community pressure demanded conformity. Margaret O'Brien created living memorial to traditional wisdom's value, mathematical proof that indigenous knowledge often contains survival strategies modern systems overlook. Her legacy measured not in monuments, but in the descendants of families who lived because she remembered what her grandmother taught when conventional wisdom had forgotten.